neck, and it just starts to crackle with all this electronic energy, and it literally feels electric.
The Yorkie radars are blinding. The Strike Eagles are cleared hot and begin hitting their targets.
We're between the two largest airfields at 5,000 feet. We are in the front row seat in the Desert Storm.
Their anti-aircraft radars gone, the Iraqis desperately scramble jets against the intruders.
About 2 minutes later, two caps are around from the Iraqis. One of them comes out of the H2 airport, one of them comes out of the vicinity of Baghdad.
The crew gets an unfriendly hit on their radar acquisition warning system. An Iraqi Mirage F-1 rolls in from above and behind the EF-111. Denton and Brandon are in serious trouble.
Companies invested more than $200 billion into U.S. EV manufacturing across the U.S. through 2024, mostly in Republican areas, and much of it in the South.
I've seen it.
The line is rising faster than anyone expected in 2026. This update cuts straight through the nonsense to reveal the most jaw-dropping construction milestones and the relentless 2026 timeline of South.
It's an exciting week because we've got the first real hints about when the debut of version 3 Starship launch could take place. The activity that we've seen this week suggests the gap between rich and poor is widening in Asia. It almost feels like before the raising. Good morning. The industrial electronics model that drives China's factory sector is based on some simple truths. The first is that any process that can be automated will be automated. The next is that any product that can be built in a factory will be mass-produced in factories. China's industrial strategy is that those processes will be automated here and that those products will be mass-produced here. They bring to bear near monopolies on raw materials at the top of all the supply chains, world-class logistics to bring those here, and then outbound again to customers across the world. Manufactured housing, houses built in factories, is another industry that Chinese are taking over. In the United States, this industry is dominated by Wall Street and private equity firms, including Berkshire Hathaway, who makes hundreds of millions of dollars per year in profits on high interest loans.
There is a United States territory in the Pacific where the government will give you land, a house.
Carbon has just been sold to its suppliers for pennies. Van Wolf recently went bankrupt, and Red Power Bikes also filed for bankruptcy just last year.
These were the three biggest e-bike startups ever. Red Power Bikes, for example, claimed that they owned 25% of the whole US e-bike market for themselves before the downfall, while all three collected well over $100 million in funding each. While many smaller players like Angel, Ico Electric, Sushi Bikes, Dost Bikes, EBC Propeller, and more all joined the race, but then many of those got wiped out even more thoroughly. The e-bike startup bubble has now definitely popped, winter is here, and so it's time for a retrospective. I talked with Elliot Wertheimer, the new CEO of OneMove, who's been trying to turn things around after their bankruptcy in 2023, and also industry analyst Prabin Joel Jones to get an independent picture of the many things that went wrong, and also to learn where things are headed to next. And what I found were not only some fascinating e-bike stories, but also some unexpected lessons for how bubbles form and pop in general.
He's sucking my finger. Yeah, he's sucking my finger. He's breathing.
Electric bikes have overall been an incredibly obvious success story around the world. And as somebody who's been riding them for years, I have no doubt about the category being here to stay. In Germany, for example, where I live, people now own well over 15 million e-bikes. This statistic already deducts e-bikes that have been disposed of, by the way, and yet the numbers just keep growing. There's now one e-bike for every 5 Germans. In the US, e-bikes have outsold both electric cars and hybrids combined in some years, becoming the most popular type of EV in the country, and globally, you get a similar picture too. While they're definitely not for everyone, all major bike brands have made electrified models a significant part of their strategy, and startups have become serious players in the industry as well. Rad Power Bikes became the clear leader in North America with roughly 600,000 bikes sold by 2023. The Dutch OneMove claims that they've sold around 200,000 bikes before their bankruptcy. Cowboy's latest estimates put them close to 100,000 units, and there's a long tail of smaller startups with sizable operations as well. In other words, electrification is a mega trend that should have eventually floated all boats. And indeed, in the early days at least, there was a lot of genuine innovation and also excitement. In 2007, Mike Rennenbaugh founded Red Power Bikes in the US. E-bikes, as a category, didn't really exist in the West yet, and so he said that he hacked together his first e-bike with motors, batteries, and controllers that he ripped out of other devices himself. He claims that his janky creations immediately turned heads, and so he built the first major e-bike brand in the West on top of this foundation. Their bikes were comparably cheap, very powerful, and featured the iconic fat tires and throttles, which have become the hallmarks of the e-bike category in the US, where distances were long and regulations were loose. Meanwhile, in 2009, 2 Dutch brothers launched the Molf. This model did not have an electric drive just yet, but it already featured integrated lights and also a remarkably sleek design. Its successor, which now carried the OneMove brand, or the VanMoof if you are Dutch I guess, well, that bike featured a chain that elegantly disappeared into the frame itself, letting you lock it up conveniently. Then in 2014, the first electric VanMoof launched, which looked like the first truly aesthetic bike without the bulky components hanging off everywhere, and soon after, VanMoof replaced its own chain innovation with the even more elegant combination of a kick lock, which blocked the back wheel along with built-in GPS tracking, an alarm signal, and also VanMoof's own bike hunters who tracked stolen bikes down on behalf of their customers. As a result, people like my studio mate Kilian now routinely leave their VanMoofs standing around in Berlin without even bothering to chain them up. Meanwhile, Cowboy from Belgium designed their first e-bike with a replaceable battery that elegantly fit into the overall design, and also popularized torque sensors, which sense how hard you pedal and automatically adjust the power output accordingly. There's no real need for gears in a city this way, and to this date, Cowboys are some of the smoothest riding e-bikes around. They also added a neat quad-lock mount with wireless charging, they added fall detection to their bikes, and along with VanMoof, they also made their apps kind of just really nice to use. The apps worked reliably, they connected to your bike instantly, and they just looked and felt really nice. Sounds trivial, but it really is not. In other words, the early days of the e-bike boom were driven by startups who brought a ton of innovation and especially attention to detail to the market. They didn't just slap a bunch of logos on a bunch of bikes that they bought from AliExpress, but instead they thoughtfully designed products that solved real customer pain points, like offering theft protection or having lights that you couldn't forget to charge. Having met a few of the founders myself and having listened to many interviews with others, it is incredibly obvious that these companies were built by people who are very passionate about building great products, and while there are always skeptics, customer demand was also very strong from the start. Rad launched their first bike with a Kickstarter campaign that immediately sold out, while VanMoof and Cowboy grew like crazy too. In the early days, if you were riding a VanMoof or a Cowboy in Berlin, people actually stopped you and asked you what you were riding. And even today, while I was filming, people came up to me and asked me what I was filming because the bikes looked so great. But behind the scenes, the first signs of danger started to appear. Being a successful startup in the 2010s meant one thing, raising loads of money, probably too much money from VCs, and the e-bike makers were no different. What we now often refer to as the era of 0% interest rate loans meant that there was simply too much VC money chasing too few good companies, and so this dynamic pushed the companies who did have some traction to just get flooded with cash. Rad raised $329 million, VanMoof around $200 million, and Cowboy around 140 million euros. Now, it is of course not inherently a bad thing if a startup raises a lot of money. After all, this allows them to, for example, develop cool new features and also to scale up. But beyond a certain point, the flood creates a mad race for hypergrowth at all costs that ends up being extremely disruptive. Take VanMoof, for example. Their next big bikes were the S3 and X3. These were great bikes in theory, except the company rushed them to market because they felt that they now had to beat the competition that also raised a ton of money, and so they released these with loads of quality control issues. Their e-shifter, for example, was fundamentally unreliable from the start and broke for every VanMoof owner that I know. The boost button routinely broke from exposure to rain, which is a mild problem when VanMoof's biggest market was the Netherlands. Their control electronics were pretty unreliable, and the list goes on. Meanwhile, despite being way more technically complex than its predecessor, VanMoof also dropped its prices for the 3 Series to under 2,000 euros. Every estimate that I found said that the company was now losing money on each bike that they sold this way. But simultaneously, they also expanded more heavily into the US, Japan, and beyond, and they also opened up stores like crazy, all of which cost a ton of money and spread them way too thin. This is the classic VC-backed blitzscaling model. A company tries to grow very rapidly, it tries to undercut all of its competitors, so hopefully many of them go bankrupt, and once it has become the dominant player in the industry, it then raises its prices. Of course, COVID then hit too and turned things up to an even crazier level. On the one hand, demand for e-bikes exploded as people wanted to skip public transportation and millions of people started to view biking as a legitimate form of commuting. You can see that Cowboy, for example, almost tripled their revenues in 2022, while the CEO of Red Power Bikes said in a podcast that they increased theirs by 300% a year. But while demand went through the roof, factories and shipping lines closed, and the companies experienced huge supply chain bottlenecks. Now, if you were lucky as a customer, then all this meant for you was that your bike perhaps got a little bit delayed. If you were a bit less lucky, then you perhaps already had a bike that broke, and now you had to wait months on end for your spare parts to arrive, leaving you functionally bikeless in the meanwhile. And if you were particularly unlucky, as I and many others were, then you became the not-so-proud owner of what I'd call a COVID bike. A bike that the company kind of Frankenstein together from whatever parts they could find on the market. See, after testing out a review unit and really liking it, I, like seemingly everybody else as well, decided to get a Cowboy for myself right in the middle of the pandemic. But unlike my reliable seeming review unit, my actual bike was anything but reliable. I got a flat tire 3 times in a row in the first week, despite replacing my tubes. My bike frame creaked constantly from the start, and the most critical parts were the brakes. They broke 5 times in a row for me. Sometimes in the front, sometimes in the back, sometimes both. I replaced each part individually. I also replaced the entire braking system twice. Nothing helped. My bike was basically permanently unusable. You know, I also share a studio with multiple guys who all had their own versions of COVID bikes from VanMoof and Cowboy, and they all had similarly horrible experiences. Now, I actually managed to get one of the Cowboy founders to admit to me during an event that they had to switch to many temporary suppliers because they just couldn't get their hands on the usual stuff that they were used to buying, and that's certainly what my bike felt like. And while that sort of stuff was horrible for customers, it was of course also catastrophic for the companies. Tripling or quadrupling their sales during the pandemic must have sounded great until they realized that they had just sold a ton of bikes that very quickly turned into a mountain of unfixable warranty cases for them. And because these bikes also relied on many custom components and were sold in a direct-to-consumer model rather than through regular bike shops, the brands had to bear all the costs of fixing these issues themselves. Now, eventually, supply chains did of course normalize, and the brands were able to fix many of their quality issues. Just as an anecdotal example, after what I think might have been my 7th failed repair attempt, Cowboy just decided to send me a replacement bike, which was supposedly the same model, except I noticed that almost all of its parts, from its charger to its brakes, were swapped out for ones from different suppliers. I've now ridden 3,600 kilometers on my replacement bike, and as you can tell, I don't exactly go easy on it, but the thing has thankfully been rock solid. In other words, I'm pretty happy right now, but that's no excuse for what happened. Tons of other riders are still out there with broken bikes, and the brand suffered tremendously as well. Not only have they lost their customers' trust and racked up millions of dollars of warranty expenses, I also heard that smaller brands especially were so desperate for any supply of any components during the height of the pandemic that many signed multi-year contracts with suppliers that they couldn't easily back out of even once they discovered that some of their parts weren't reliable enough. Imagine having binding contracts that mean you have to buy components that you know are not going to be good enough. That just seems crazy right now, but remember, just a couple of years ago, many really smart people, including people like the founder of Rad Power Bikes, thought that this boom was really here to stay.
We think a switch was flipped on, the light has been shed on e-bikes as a tool for the masses. And so now it's not so much about just keeping up with this demand that has spiked from COVID-19, people working from home, shopping from home, looking for social distance, ways to get around. But this is a switch that is flipped on and it's not turning off.
So the companies often went all out on building up production capacities. But in retrospect, we now know, of course, that the pandemic era boom was mostly temporary. Rad Power Bikes, for example, saw their revenues cut in half in the last 3 years. And it's a similar picture for Cowboy from their peak in 2022. As it turns out, yes, people did want their e-bikes, but no, COVID was a temporary distortion that just drew a few years of demand forward. And even worse, for Cowboy, we also know what their losses look like, and these remained stubbornly high even as their revenue dropped. As it turns out, they still have to spend money on fixing the mountains of broken e-bikes that they sold during the COVID crunch. And in fact, it wasn't just the startups that overproduced. The experts that I've talked to, like Pravin, have told me that the traditional